To their seats. We'll go ahead and get started a little bit with some trivia questions. There's prizes involved. All right. Name the first National Wildlife Refuge with the word fish in its name. Upper Miss. Who was that? I'll get with you in a second. All right, Jurassic Park was filmed on what National Wildlife Refuge? It wasn't in Madison, Wisconsin. Nope. Hakula Forest National Wildlife Refuge in Hawaii. All right. What National Wildlife Refuge in Utah had a Pony Express station in 1860 and 1861? Fish Springs. Who was that back there? All right. I'll get you your prizes in just a second. But first I wanted to introduce our panel today and our presenters today for land protection and planning in the 21st century. First we have Heather Abbey. Heather began working for Fish and Wildlife Service a short time ago in the Ecological Services Office in Ventura, California. Grant Harris is the Chief of Biological Services Division in Region 2. And Chris Metzger recently joined the Fish and Wildlife Service, also in the Biological Research or Biological Science Division, also in Region 2. So, welcome.
Okay, my name is Grant. I'm going to start off with describing how this workshop came to be. Last November, a number of the core teams for the vision process gathered together to discuss, the status of where they were with developing the different chapters for. Thank you. I can talk louder. Last November, when a number of core teams gathered here in Madison to discuss the status of where the vision process was, a number of the core groups got together. There was a science core group, there was a planning core group, and a delivery core group. And as we discussed, our current ideas, we realized there was an overlapping theme, which was this land protection planning, this national collaborative conservation strategy, and with the discussion being how can the Fish and Wildlife Service create greater influence and extend our principles and our mission over wider landscapes and incorporate other DOI partners, state partners, and NGOs. And so after Madison, there was representatives from those three different teams that did a lot of discussion on what a strategic planning would look like, what land protection planning would look like, and we happen to be the lucky ones up front talking about it, but there's a number of you in the audience, and we thank you. All these ideas we'll be talking about today stem from that collaborative effort from that group and others that were involved in the exercise, so we thank you. As far as the structure of today's workshop, Chris is going to provide some background about conservation planning, landscape ecology principles. Heather is then going to define what land protection planning is at this point and what a national collaborative conservation strategy is up to this point. And then I will get into implementation of a national collaborative conservation strategy. This is, a discussion and a work in progress. And so we would like this to be a working workshop as best we can with a group this size. So Chris will speak first, followed by Heather and myself. We'll probably break it up and have some discussion between our different sections, but certainly have reserved some time at the end. I will be taking notes. We'll all be taking notes throughout this talk, throughout the discussion. And at the end of this, over time, what we would like to do is draft a white paper or a gray paper for the service that describes your thoughts, our thoughts, where we're at on what a national collaborative conservation strategy would look like.
Okay, thank you, Grant. I'd just like to start us off with kind of a motivational message, if you will, to get us thinking about some of the issues that we're going to be talking about here today. The issue of how to adapt our current conservation strategy to the challenges that we face in the 21st century is one of the most important tasks and opportunities that we will face this decade. In order to continue to sustain and recover nature's most precious resources, we need to be thinking well into the future and at a landscape scale. Climate change will have a large and unpredictable impact on many of our already imperiled species and habitats. Loss of habitat and fragmentation is accelerating, and extinction is occurring at a rate we have not seen in modern times. In many cases, we will have to drastically change our management strategies for many of our refuges and species. We will not be able to effectively move forward without the backing of the American public and support of all of our partners, so we must continue to work with them at every opportunity possible to find solutions to these pressing challenges that we face.
Thanks, Heather. As Grant mentioned, my name's Chris, and I'm just going to be going over a little of the background of land protection planning, what it is, and why we need it. But before I start, I wanted to just put some images that should be familiar to most of you up here. So we have a map that shows the National Wildlife Refuge System, national parks, the landscape conservation cooperatives, and then land that's managed by the BLM. But I could have put a lot of other maps up here too, things like the Forest Service land, military lands, and also different kinds of public and private lands. And the idea is that throughout these, our presentations and then also the discussions, we want to be thinking larger than the refuge network. We want to be thinking how the conservation that we have in place can be incorporated into the larger landscape. So the problems that we have today, and a lot of this was covered this morning, but the problems that we have today are not that different than the problems that we had yesterday. What is different is our problems are getting a lot bigger, they're getting wider in breadth, and the resources that we have to deal with them are getting smaller. These problems are occurring at landscape scales, things like land use change, pollution, climate change. And what this picture represents is you see lots of different ecosystems. You see a mountain, and you can imagine that snowpack could be affected by climate change, which will affect the timing and the extent of runoff, and that could impact landscapes farther down, such as the forest, and then you have different land use that goes and occurs on forest lands, and then your water is flowing through cities, and then you have pollution and garbage issues related to that. So if you're trying to manage a landscape that's down farther, such as in the marina area, you can't just look at your particular area. You have to consider what's going on in the whole area. So the question is, how are we going to manage in the future with these challenges in mind? So land use is really any change in cover type or hydrology in the landscape, and then development is lots of different things such as energy corridors and transportation infrastructure, but the end result is generally fragmentation on the landscape. So these two pictures are two different time frames. Back in the early 80s in a town called Shenzhen in China, there was a little town, relatively speaking, of about 300,000 people, about the size of Madison. And today, just 30 years later, that is now a city of close to, actually over 10 million people. So I think that's a really good example of how rapid change can happen. And obviously, China is the fastest growing economy in the history of the world, but the United States is not that far behind. Actually, 1 in 3 acres ever developed in the United States was developed in that same time frame, so basically in the last 30 years. And even now, every year, 1.6 million acres is sold to development. So development and land use change can be extremely rapid, and the other important thing to remember is that right now is the best case scenario that we've got. So, development is not really showing any signs of slowing at this point. So land use change impacts ecosystem services, things like water quality, hydrology, soil fertility and the integrity of the soil, ground cover, and then lots and lots of other things. And the other important point is that change that occurs in one ecosystem can affect things in other ecosystems. So I think a good example of this is a very iconic ecosystem, the Serengeti, has one really main water source that flows through it. And animals rely on this water source, particularly in times of drought. And what's happening is well beyond the borders of the protected area, but even beyond the borders of the ecosystem itself, up in a watershed, there's been a lot of deforestation and a lot of diversion of water for agriculture up in that area, and it has reduced the flow of the Mara River by almost 70%. So now they're projecting that in times of drought, that river is just going to completely stop flowing. So as you can imagine, that's a really challenging position to be in as a land manager, knowing that you've got close to 2 million animals that rely on that water source, and it's going to essentially be disappearing. So how are we going to deal with these kinds of issues is the real question. So fragmentation is the breaking up. So now I'm just going to sort of talk about some general principles that are sort of the background for what Heather and Grant are going to be going into more in depth. But fragmentation is essentially the breaking up of habitat or cover type into smaller disconnected units. So up in the far left-hand corner of the picture, you have an intact forest, and then through time, through lots of different processes, human-caused mostly, you get fragmentation. So now you still have some intact forest areas in that. So why do we really care about fragmentation? Well, fragmentation affects nearly all ecological patterns and processes. It affects things like gene flow, it affects hydrology, wind movement, nutrient cycling, and then of particular importance, it has a lot of different species effects. And fragmentation effects on species are almost always negative. Things like it has a tendency to increase isolation and increase generalist species. It has an increase in edge species and exotic species. I'm sure that many have seen that occurring in lands that they've been involved with. Increase in nest predation, and then ultimately it leads to increased extinction rates. While at the same time it leads to decreases in rare species, decreases in dispersal limited species, and decreases in interior species and large species. So what's a way forward? What's a strategic way to move forward with all of these challenges? And one would be to strategically locate preserves with some principles in mind that address these realities and these challenges that we know are underway. And to do that, we really need to consider the landscape characteristics. So now I'm going to talk about what those landscape characteristics are and why they're important for land management. So the matrix is what we call the background cover type in a landscape. So you can think of, if you have a protected area, you have boundaries on that protected area, and what you have outside is of critical importance, the integrity of that landscape outside. So as you can imagine, if you have a protected area that's a wilderness area that's a forest, and then outside it you have a multi-use forest area, that integrity of that matrix is probably going to be better than if you had a protected area that was surrounded by parking lots and housing developments. So the integrity of the matrix is really an important consideration for management and conservation. Patches are surface areas that differ from their surroundings. So a lot of work has been done with this with both birds and butterflies. So how the different patches are configured in space is really important, and how they interact with one another, so what the patch dynamics are. And a good example of that is the work that was done on the northern spotted owl. So what they figured out was that the patch size was really important, but it was also really important how far apart the patches were located. So another aspect of patch dynamics is what we call source and sinks. So over on the left, you have a red circle, and that would be what we consider the source population, and that's where your birth rates of your animals is going to be higher than your death rates. And then you have animals that disperse out to satellite areas. And a lot of times, due to fragmentation and other land use effects, what you get is sinks in population. So they go out to try to find other habitats, and then in those areas, their birth rates actually are lower than their death rate, so you get a negative population increase. And in the picture to the right, you have more of a synergistic movement of gene flow between different patches, and that has important implications for management. Connectivity is the spatial continuity of a habitat or a cover type. So if you have a landscape that has more connectivity, that is an important consideration for what kinds of species you're planning on managing. And then that ties in really well with corridors, which are strips of a particular type that differ from the areas adjacent on both sides. So a lot of animals use corridors to move from one area of suitable habitat to another area of suitable habitat. And then edges and boundaries, so which is an ecosystem or a cover type near its perimeter that differs from the interior locations. So a lot of birds that are forest interior obligate species don't live at a certain buffer from a boundary. So let's say they don't live, 3 miles from a boundary. So if you have a preserve that's only a 10 by 10 mile area, your effective size of your preserve is going to be much smaller if you're trying to manage for some of those interior birds. So landscape characteristics are important for conservation and species management for the examples that I just showed you, and then lots of other ones, but I'll just summarize. Some species are habitat specialists, while others are habitat generalists. Some species are area sensitive and isolation sensitive, and then lots of species are also edge sensitive. One thing I didn't bring up earlier is the disturbance sensitivity. So if you have one preserve and you have one particular animal that you're trying to manage on that preserve, and that's the only place that occurs, and it gets wiped out by some sort of natural disaster, that's going to be a really difficult management problem. And then the flip side of that is that some species are obligate disturbed species, and I always think of lodgepole pine, which is has regeneration events that are triggered by fire disturbance. So how these landscape characteristics translate to reserve design is a topic that's received considerable attention, and in general, reserve designs should capture the full range of biological diversity in an area, be designed to be as large as possible, have several redundant preserves, and generally that's better than a single preserve, and that's partially due to that disturbance principle I just brought up. They should be connected, and they should really consider the integrity of the matrix or what's around it. However, it frequently proves difficult to apply these guidelines in the real world, and often they conflict with other land use issues. So I'm going to use the analogy that Grant's going to go into a little bit more in detail, but it's sort of like putting a puzzle together. So you have different species with different needs. And so trying to come up with a preserve design that captures a lot of those different needs is very difficult, and it's like putting a puzzle together. So here on the left is a picture of what could potentially be like a puzzle, like a solved puzzle of an ideal preserve design. But then trying to put that onto the landscape. So over on the right is basically the human footprint. So areas in red are places that are really human-dominated landscapes. It's not hard to imagine that putting those principles on the landscape can be really challenging. So what are the limitations of the current protected area system that we have in place? Generally, the boundaries are political. They're not ecologically based. The boundaries are permeable. They're generally not large enough, particularly things for top carnivores and free-roaming animals or migrating animals. And they don't capture the full range of the natural disturbance regime. Generally, the preserves or the protected areas are not in control of the water sources that they depend on. They're not connected. And then I just put others down there because I'm hoping that maybe during the discussion we can talk about experiences that people have had with limitations based on the landscape configuration of some of the lands that people have been managing. So what's the best approach considering these challenges ahead? And that's what Heather's going to be going into much more in depth on this, and so is Grant, but it's basically science-based policy and implementation that guides strategic growth and partnership. So using science-based methods to strategically locate conservation objectives on the ground. So it's using science to identify and prioritize valuable lands for conservation and goals. So where on the landscape are these important corridors? Where are the rare habitats? where are the critical water access areas and the nesting areas? And that's just a short little list, but where are the pieces of the puzzle? Who's in charge of those pieces? Obviously we have the Wildlife Preserve Network has a really small piece of those puzzles. So where are the other pieces? Identifying them and prioritizing them. And then trying to work out partnerships and collaboration. So what we're not really talking about is the simple growth of the protected area network. More what we're talking about is a strategic expansion through partnership and cooperation. Trying to find ways to find a common ground, particularly between conservation and development. So if you have some really, for example, you're in the Great Basin, you prioritize some intact sage habitat, and you also identify where some cheatgrass habitat is that you have deemed irreversibly cheatgrass. Well, the BLM, maybe you can talk to them because they have a mandate to put in solar farms, and they could put in solar farms in some of the less priority habitats. So finding ways and trying to build these partnerships to come to solutions that integrate both conservation and development. And what that would do, it would increase the effective ecosystem size or the ecosystem services. It could increase the flow of materials, and then a potential goal would be metapopulation and creating intact migration routes. So for example, having a free roaming North American bison population through taking down fences and collaboration and partnerships. So this idea isn't really anything new. It's very similar to what the Fish and Wildlife have coined as strategic habitat conservation, and I'm hoping that this is a topic that we can talk about during the discussion. People's experience using this framework, which is sort of an adaptive framework loop, but it has some very complementary ideas with what we're talking about today. And then there's a lot of other examples, I think really inspiring examples, the Yellowstone to Yukon, where their goal is to conserve important habitat and corridors between Yellowstone and Yukon. And they say they're one of the largest wildlife connectivity projects in the world. So they're trying to link this huge corridor between the Yellowstone and the Yukon, and their target is grizzly bears, birds, and fish. And then they strategically selected grizzly bears because it's a wide-ranging species that has a huge wildlife conflict component to it. So the idea is that they can collaborate with people and build these partnerships to conserve those kinds of areas that a grizzly bear would need. They would be able to conserve a lot of land that other things would need as well. And the website's up there too. I encourage you to go take a look because it's a pretty nice website. And then Nature Conservancy, Conservation by Design, that's another one. And then Jim Stone talked about the Blackfoot Challenge this morning, another really inspirational land conservation planning initiative. And then my personal favorite, the Landscape Conservation Cooperatives, and then also America's Great Outdoors. And Heather's going to be talking quite a bit more in depth on these. But the idea is really to start working together, recognizing that these problems are bigger than any one agency, and we need to work together to try to solve some of these problems. And I think that's really where the root of a lot of these initiatives is. So I'm going to stop there, and I think we're going to try to have like 10 minutes, 15 minutes of just discussion on some of these topics, and then we'd like to get some feedback from you and hear maybe some of your personal experiences with strategic habitat conservation through Fish and Wildlife or through other things. And
it might be easier for Heather to start on defining the National Collaborative Conservation Strategy, then we could probably kick into some of that stuff. Thanks, Chris.
Okay, so I'm just going to be talking to you a little bit about what we're talking about when we say a National Collaborative Conservation Strategy. I mean, we heard the term several times this morning, and also just kind of some ways that really the background is already laid for us, the foundation is already there. So this is something that I'm sure many of you in the room are already very familiar with. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's mission is working with others to conserve, protect, and enhance fish, wildlife, and plants and their habitats for the continuing benefit of the American people. And these are the guiding principles of the National Wildlife Refuge System. I'm sure many of you are also very familiar with these. But I would like to draw your attention to a few of the ones that are highlighted here in bold. So the first one up there is talking about Leopold's land ethic. And it says, we seek to reflect that land ethic in our stewardship and to instill it in others. And then the second one down there says, we owe it to the American people to have a voice in the protection of their trust resources. And then lastly, and very importantly, partnerships with those who want to help us meet our mission are welcome and indeed essential. Partnerships and conservation are really the main messages here. These concepts apply not only to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but far beyond. We need to increase collaboration across jurisdictional boundaries to meet our conservation objectives. So I just want to open it up to the audience here for a minute and see if anybody has any ideas on what collaborative landscape conservation means to you. So what would that include? Who does it involve? Where is it located? And how does it work? Does anybody have any ideas on what something like that is? Anybody? Yes?
I would like to suggest that it involves communities too.
Definitely, yeah. Anybody else? Okay, well, we have a few ideas actually on what that might mean. And that brings me to the concept of designing a national collaborative conservation strategy. So what do we mean when we say this term? Basically, we're talking about a national strategic plan for conservation designed to help the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and other entities work with each other and the public to fulfill common conservation goals and objectives and address large-scale ecological issues through collaborative landscape-level efforts. The concept of collaborative conservation is nothing new. We've actually been doing it for years. But we currently lack a strategic plan for coordinating this effort across jurisdictional boundaries throughout the nation. This concept goes far beyond the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and partnerships as we have often thought of them in the past. We are now facing a myriad of national and global ecological threats that are forcing us to change our thinking to a more holistic, landscape-level conservation approach that goes beyond agency or political boundaries. We must plan for an uncertain future the best that we can by increasing our knowledge base and combining resources to enable us to accomplish more with less. We need a strategic plan for conservation that is developed in concert with our partners, which will not only help us to accomplish the goals within the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Department of the Interior, but will also highlight opportunities to work together to achieve conservation where our goals align with our partners. The general elements of a national collaborative conservation strategy include conservation planning, land protection, science, natural resource management, education and outreach, and partnerships, both within the service and other federal agencies, state and local agencies, NGOs, research organizations, and the public. Really what we're after here is how to accomplish conservation in a more coordinated way where our goals align at the national level. But I want to clarify that when I say the national level, I mean a coordinated nationwide effort guided by unified policy where ideas, priorities, and implementation still come from the local, regional, and state levels. So why do we need a national conservation strategy? Well, Greg said this morning that the National Wildlife Refuge System Improvement Act of 1997 directs the Secretary of the Interior to plan for the continued growth of the National Wildlife Refuge System. The steady increase in habitat conversion, invasive species, pollution, and fragmentation over the last few years, combined with the rapid changes expected to result from climate change, introduce a whole new level of complexity to design, management, and long-term viability of our refuges and protected lands. As Chris brought up earlier, species, water, and other crucial ecological services do not recognize human land boundaries. Minimizing current threats to native species and key ecosystem processes requires strategies of preserving large areas, minimizing fragmentation, and maintaining landscape connectivity, in addition to creating and maintaining biological redundancies throughout the system. This requires strategic planning at the national level where all key players have a seat at the table. By having a more coordinated strategic plan that is developed together with our partners and includes a collaborative vision for conservation, we will be able to avoid duplicative efforts and expand our efficacy. We need to start thinking along the lines of a conservation estate and management actions that are administered across jurisdictional boundaries and planned for at all relevant spatial scales. A system where all actions are based on a commitment to a culture of scientific excellence and transparency. We should strive to work together to design a collaborative and innovative national conservation strategy that becomes a model for how conservation is implemented across the globe. Luckily, much of the groundwork has already been laid out for us. Earlier this year, President Obama released America's Great Outdoors Initiative to develop a 21st century conservation and recreation agenda. America's Great Outdoors, or AGO, emphasizes local grassroots conservation solutions and making the federal government a better partner with states, tribes, and local communities. AGO's vision calls for connecting Americans to the great outdoors, conserving and restoring America's great outdoors, and working together for America's great outdoors. I'm not going to go through all of them, but on the slide here I've emphasized a few of the statements from the AGO report that directly support creation of a national conservation strategy. You'll see in the middle there, one of the statements says, "Our vision is for the federal government to act as a catalyst for federal, state, tribal, and local entities and private interests to work together across America to protect a network of critical ecosystems, natural resource areas, and recreational lands from the inner city to wildlands." And then just below that, a very key point, no single entity, whether federal, state, local, or private, can provide the resources needed to achieve the breadth and depth of action proposed in this report. So a national collaborative conservation strategy then would be a logical outgrowth not only of the National Wildlife Refuge System vision process, but of the AGO initiative as well, and can be an important means to an end identified in AGO. A national conservation strategy would also create the forum to specifically address many of the AGO recommendations, specifically some of the ones that I've outlined here on the slide. In order to make the best use of the federal funds provided through Wildlife Conservation and Restoration Program and the State Wildlife Grants Program, Congress charged each state and territory with developing a statewide wildlife action plan. The State Wildlife Action Plans give us the ability to conserve wildlife and the lands and waters where they live for future generations and are an integral part of any national conservation strategy. Conservation targets for each state have already been outlined within the State Wildlife Action Plans, so again, a lot of the groundwork is already there for us. In 2010, the service released their Climate Change Strategic Action Plan, which establishes a basic framework for the service to work as a part of the larger conservation community to help ensure sustainability of fish, wildlife, plants, and habitats in the face of accelerating climate change. There's also a lot of overlap between some of the collaborative and landscape-level conservation themes that are set forth in this document and the National Conservation Strategy concept. And I've outlined, again, a few of them on the slide here. So in bold, you can see that it says, "We must build shared scientific and technical capabilities with others and work more collaboratively than ever before with the conservation community." Some climate change principles are also outlined in the document, and these are also directly in line with the National Conservation Strategy. They include priority setting, partnership, best science, landscape conservation, and a global approach. And again, also from the Climate Strategic Action Plan, on page 3, it says that we must work on defining our role within the context of the Department of the Interior and the larger conservation community. And then just below that, it talks about sustaining fish and wildlife nationally and internationally. So clearly, we have to start looking beyond just our local areas and regional boundaries, but then also maybe even beyond our own borders. A national collaborative conservation strategy also provides a forum to address many of the wonderful ideas that came up throughout the visioning process. And a lot of these ideas, as you've heard, the bold ideas that came in the comments, reach far beyond the National Wildlife Refuge System or even just the Fish and Wildlife Service. And I've outlined, again, a few of them on the slide here, but there was many that could apply here. But we were talking about leading creation of a national land and water conservation plan, things like implementing a national environmental education strategy, teaching children to respect and learn about nature, building wildlife corridors between refuges, sanctuaries, and protected open space, and the list goes on. But all of these could really fall under a national collaborative conservation strategy. Essentially, a national conservation strategy can be broken down into two main parts. The first part being conservation planning and delivery, and education, outreach, and partnerships. This is, of course, assuming that some of the other elements that I talked about earlier, such as science, are looped throughout the two main categories. The first part relates to conservation planning, land protection, and natural resource management, and includes the following components. First off, identification of conservation targets. As I mentioned, this has largely already been done in each of the state wildlife action plans. Secondly, collection of information assessing existing conservation areas based on biodiversity values, threats, and conservation targets, and identifying gaps. Third, establishment of bold conservation goals and priorities, and LCCs, as we talked about earlier, could be a perfect forum to get some of these conversations going. Fourth, evaluation of the viability and integrity of conservation targets. Fifth, selection and design of a network of conservation areas that preserves these conservation targets and contributes towards meeting our conservation goals, both as a part of the refuge system and external to the refuge system. And then lastly, evaluation and monitoring of the process to ensure that the strategy is meeting the program objectives. Is what we're doing working? And if not, how can we adapt? Strategic growth of the refuge system and protected lands network is an integral component of the land protection element of the National Collaborative Conservation Strategy concept. We should develop a national framework and spatially explicit blueprint within the next 2 years that prioritizes the conservation of critical focal areas and supports system-wide conservation planning. This framework and blueprint would be utilized to guide strategic growth of the refuge system and beyond, and consists of 4 main elements, with the first being evaluation of the purpose of an existing or potential protected area. Second, analysis of the potential changes an area might undergo as a result of climate change and other stressors. Third, prioritization based on the urgency for conservation in a particular place at a particular time. And lastly, a feasibility analysis. Is it even possible? Within this blueprint, we need to focus on facilitation of evolutionary adaptation and preservation of biodiversity, representative ecosystems, biological resilience, and undeveloped lands and linkages to facilitate geographic range transitions among all species. Completing existing refuges will make them more resilient by buffering them from encroachment, helping to reduce other stressors, securing water resources, and in some circumstances, providing better landscape connectivity. However, in some cases, it may actually make more sense to reevaluate and focus our efforts in an entirely new area. This is where it will help to have a blueprint that considers all of the necessary factors, for example, climate change, land ownership and availability, current condition of the land, et cetera, et cetera. And this blueprint could be updated as needed. Grant's going to get into a little bit more of the detail on the actual implementation and design of a blueprint. The second part of a national conservation strategy relates to partnerships, education, and outreach to achieve collaborative conservation. We should work with our partners to identify local, national, and global conservation priorities and link these with clear conservation goals and objectives across various temporal and spatial scales. We need to involve partner agencies, organizations, local communities, and other stakeholders at all stages in the process, from priority setting to implementation and evaluation. As a result of implementation of a national conservation strategy, we will be better able to plan and carry out management actions that transcend jurisdiction. We also need to emphasize the role that National Wildlife Refuges and other protected areas and conservation initiatives play in local communities through increased outreach to the public, stressing the importance and relevance of conservation to the people. We should build off other innovative collaborative conservation efforts, emphasizing involvement of partners and local communities, such as some of the examples that Chris went over earlier. Creating a national collaborative conservation strategy that includes every state and territory and even areas outside of our borders seems like a daunting task. but it is not impossible, and in fact, it is necessary. Everyone is talking about the need for conservation at the landscape level and increased coordination and collaboration. The time to act is now, and much of the foundation has already been laid out for us. So that's all that I have. I'd like to open it up if the audience has any questions or has anything to discuss on that, and if not, we can move into the third half. But feel free to raise your hand if you have anything you'd like to say. Okay, guess you're up, Grant.
Thanks. Chris has described foundational principles of landscape ecology, which would underpin a national collaborative conservation strategy. Heather has defined what a national collaborative conservation strategy is and how that tiers into other DOI and Fish and Wildlife Service objectives. I will now cover the final segment and discuss approaches for implementing a national collaborative conservation strategy. For after all, as this photograph models, we all must fulfill our roles as responsible stewards of the landscape. For this final piece, it's been divided into 6 segments. The first one will be building an ecosystem context, and we'll talk about what that means. The second one will be identifying the objectives. What do you actually want to do across the landscape? We don't want to be haphazard or ad hoc. We want to be strategic in our approach and clearly define our objectives, what the target is, and what the measurements of success are. The third piece would be what scientific information do we have now that would support a national collaborative conservation strategy? What do we have in hand that could help guide us? The fourth would be techniques that we have in hand that we've spoken about and we've heard today about how to implement the National Collaborative Conservation Strategy. Building the puzzle would be one, and a little short story. Unfortunately, to my wife's dismay, my son inherited my geeky qualities, and so about an hour ago he called me, and I just grabbed the phone and he said, "Hey Dad, I'm working on some math. Could you help me factor these quadratic equations?" And so I don't know how many fathers get a call in the middle of July about a son who wants to work on quadratic equations, but I feel awful proud. Anyhow, I said, son, I can't talk right now. We're getting ready for a discussion. And he said, "Well, what are you talking about?" And I said, "Well, the Forest Service has land, and Fish and Wildlife Service has land, and BLM has land, and the Park Service has land. And right now we kind of manage more or less sort of isolated, and the idea is for us to work together in more unison and manage the landscape as one to help conserve species." He's like, "Oh, it's like building a puzzle." And I'm like, "Yeah, that's exactly it." So I felt real good. He got it. And then the last piece would be commitment. And in order for this to work, it really needs people that are impassioned and dedicated to drive the process home. Otherwise, it just falls apart. So we'll start from ecosystem context and what that means. And so from a refuge standpoint, I think, and I'm going to be stereotypical, so I guess at the end of this you can ransack me in the hallway, but what we want to be is more like that tarsier and have open eyes and say, what do I have in this parcel of land, no matter what it is? What sort of species and habitats? Are they doing well? Are they thriving, or are they just kind of limping along? How unique is this situation? Are they also off my parcel of land? Are they thriving out there? And knowing the status of what you have on your property, that basic inventory, and the status of those species and habitats, and knowing what's happening off your property, that builds your context. And that helps describe what are the most pressing conservation and management issues, not only in the ecosystem, but how you contribute to that, and what's your piece or role in that puzzle. Building that context helps you for that. We don't want to have the blinders on and just be within our boundary. So as I just mentioned, the whole idea, you build an inventory of what you have on your parcel. That's a great emphasis area for the burgeoning inventory monitoring program within refuges. What's the status on and off refuge of these species and habitats? And in the end, it helps define what the question is. It helps build greater unity across landscapes, and it involves multi-scale perspectives. So it involves what's happening on your parcel of land and what's happening so it's local, and then regional, then ecosystem-wide, that whole sort of exercise. I hope that gets the context point across. So if we're just focused on our little piece, it's hard to see the whole puzzle. But when we see the whole puzzle, then we can see what our fit is and what our role is throughout that whole ecosystem. And every piece of land has an important role based on the principles that Chris has already described. So I guess as part of this process, we want to be contributory. And so one of the emphasis themes would be, given that piece of land, how could it maximize its contribution to the most pressing conservation and management issues within the ecosystem that it resides? And so it kind of gives us a chance to think, as Rick was saying earlier today, and taking a step back and saying, okay, based on what I have, how can I most contribute to what's happening around me? Now, granted, we have other things going on. We have, we provide hunting opportunities. We manage for other species based on our neighboring legislation. I'm not suggesting we interfere with that, but I'm saying we can also be contributory from other angles and actually look at this from a more unified context across a wider landscape. So once we build that ecosystem context, we could subsequently define what our objectives are. And these could be a number of different things based on that context. They could be species-centric. For example, we want to build populations of ocelots in southern Texas to a given level so we can remove them from the T&E list. They could involve biological redundancies and build resiliency in the landscape. So say for black-footed ferrets, we want so many populations of so many individuals, again, to help conserve the species. It could be biodiversity-based. We want to maximize biodiversity in an area. There can be some unintended consequences of that, which I'll talk about in a little while. It may be some things that are unique, biological uniqueness that we want to preserve. Ecological services, ecosystem health, those are also important goals. And we need to understand threats, where the threat's going to happen, when they're going to happen, where, when, and what do we anticipate species responding to. And those threats could be climatic or other anthropogenic stressors. And any talk would be incomplete without a slide on climate change. And so we've seen graphs like these. Well, I don't know if it's coming out, but the lower left, the Earth is getting warmer. It's happening. The graph on the right is work from Catherine Hayhoe at Texas Tech, which he kindly shared with me. And what that is showing, you can barely, well, I wish, there. So that's Massachusetts, and based on maximum temperature and relative humidity, if you have a low emission scenario, it's yellow. If it's a high emission scenario, it's red. And that shows comparatively what the climate of Massachusetts would be like over time based on a different emission scenario. It's rather striking. And so as managers of the land, while the climate science hasn't gotten to the point we could say, given this parcel, what changes can we expect? What we need to know is, where a change is going to happen, how fast are they going to happen, what species will be affected, how they could be affected, and how soon is this going to happen and how quickly. And granted, we already have stressors on the landscape today. We have fragmentation, urbanization, energy extraction, transportation corridors, and we need to respond to those now, and the response would be, as Chris has mentioned earlier, we want to build biological redundancies, we want to preserve large habitat chunks, and we want to build corridors and linkages. And those same responses to those stresses we have now make sense from a climate change adaptation standpoint. So we don't have to wait for the science necessarily to get to us yet. We can respond right now and start doing some strategic planning from a national collaborative standpoint. Other objectives we can do, Chris talked about corridors of habitats. There's other ways you can look at it. This is a slide describing pronghorn migration. It's actually the longest migration, nearly the longest migration in North America outside of caribou in the Arctic. It's occurring in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. There's work afoot now to help preserve the corridors of movement between the Tetons and Green River in Wyoming. So there's an objective saying we want to maintain this historic migratory route across this landscape. Biodiversity and species, there's a quote there from Jared Diamond. The question is not which refuge contains more total species, but which contains more species that would be doomed to extinction in the absence of refuges. And so we have to think about this. When we manage our landscapes, when we want to build that context, what are we actually managing for, and what are the implications of that? So biodiversity isn't so much what you have per se, but it's the kind of the quality of what you have. You can have very high biodiversity of very common species, but some places might have a better value if they have much less biodiversity of species that are of more conservation concern. An example of this would be the eastern deciduous forest. This is not federal land, this is a state property. Okay, so you have old growth forest, great habitat for black and white warblers, ovenbirds, and the like. Okay, the management of this landscape is actually halting succession, creating more fields, creating wide trails to build more biodiversity. But in the end, what they're doing is reducing, you have a much more rare habitat, an opportunity to manage for habitats of high value for species that are of conservation concern. And so by managing for biodiversity, you're actually reducing regional biodiversity. So from an ecosystem standpoint, it would make more sense for a site like this to manage for species that are more conservation concern, and biodiversity goals could be met on another piece of property. But together they're working synergistically, so we're still across the whole landscape, we're meeting our different targets in a unified front, instead of trying to do it all within our given fence. Last slide on this is, the reason I've kind of brought this one up with the biodiversity one is to provide kind of a point of introspection and to, again, more thinking about what we actually do. Obviously, from the Fish and Wildlife Service standpoint, and I guess from our own personal standpoints, all species are worthy of, all of them have important roles to play, and they all do the equal respect. Some are of conservation concern and some are not. And so the question is, which ones do we actually manage for and which ones do we not worry about? And I think knowing the answer to that, again, helps build your role, your ecosystem context, and that national collaborative conservation strategy. We're working together to help species and habitats. So the goal here is, so just kind of recapping objectives and context. Ecosystem context and the objective, it helps determine what is your piece of that puzzle, what is your role, okay? But also when you build the context and the objective, you could say, okay, where else across this landscape can I best meet this goal? And so it works both ways. And then both require, landscape scales, multi-scale perspectives, building the context, what's your approach, your justification, and defining what success is. I'll now get into some science support we have now to start building this National Collaborative Conservation Strategy. Back in the late 70s, early 80s, Jared Diamond postulated that large areas have more species than smaller areas, which was subsequently attacked by Dan Simberloff, saying, well, that assumption is that if you have all these little small parcels, then that large parcel will encapsulate them all, which drove a lot of conservation biology in the 80s. Well, that whole debate was called the single large or several small, the SLOS debate, and it winds up that, yes, in fact, large chunks of habitat do preserve more species than not. How big do you need to get? Well, fortunately, Thomas Lovejoy from the Smithsonian at the time went down to Brazil. They were going to deforest parts of the Amazon regardless, and he said, hey, before you do that, why don't you leave some fragments so we could look at how birds go extinct over time. And so there are different fragment sizes. And the result of that work shows that if you have a parcel of forest of 250 acres, from a forest bird perspective, you would lose your species in 10 to 20 years, half your species in 10 to 20 years. If you're 100 times that size, or 25,000 acres, you could lose half your species in about a century. So we're talking, we need, from a bird perspective, you need large chunks of habitat. From a range-wide perspective, we could talk about fragment sizes, but how much total range do you need? Well, you can look at, again, with information from birds, because we have most data covering birds, that if you look at how small a range size gets before it's considered threatened by extinction by the IUCN, if a bird's range is below the size of New Hampshire and Vermont combined, then the IUCN considers it threatened by extinction. Okay, now that doesn't have to be just one, that's not one chunk, that could be multiple chunks, but it's around 11,000 square kilometers. That's how much total range you need. So what does that mean for refuges? So being from Region 2, I can kind of pick on my region a little bit here. And what that histogram shows is the count of parcels on the y-axis and the size of those parcels on the x-axis. Now, there's only around 50 or so refuges in Region 2. But some refuges have multiple parcels, okay? So these are just the patches of the fragment sizes that the refuge house. So if you look at that, you could say half of all those parcels are below 250 acres. So in 10 or 20 years, they will lose half their species. They probably, if from a bird perspective, if they were forest birds, they'd already be gone. 95% are below 25,000 acres. So it'll be a century before they would lose their species. The point of this slide, that I guess the emphasis here, is that if we are genuine in trying to extend our mission to preserve and restore species and habitats across the landscape, we have to work off our refuge parcels and collaboratively with other agencies to make sure we have enough land base to make it happen. Otherwise, we're going to fall short of that mission. We just don't have the area within. By ourselves, we're few and small in the lower 48, and we have to work beyond our borders to make this work. I'll just cover birds again briefly. The reason there's birds examples is because, to best of my knowledge, we don't have these sort of quantitative thresholds for other taxa. If you know of some, then please share with me, but I have yet to hear of them. This is just, I was kind of focusing on area before. Now there's also the spatial configuration of the landscape, which is important. And all this shows here on the left is an original range of this pink-headed warbler that lives in Chiapas and Guatemala. And the right side is this range now. But you can look at the size of patches, the spatial configuration, how far apart they are, and colonization, extinction rates, and get an idea of which patches are most important on the landscape now, and if you were to restore patches, which one to have the most value later. So we have some guidelines, and I guess the last piece that we learned from the Amazon is birds rarely disperse more than 5 kilometers. These forest interior birds. So again, gives you some guidelines on what that configuration needs to be. Certainly, if you're working for different taxa, like small carnivores or migratory birds, these are going to change. But again, we have some guidelines in place. Techniques that we can use for a national collaborative conservation strategy. The INM program is fortunately promulgating the use of hydrogeomorphic analyses. Okay, irrespective of who's conducting them, what this approach does is it looks at the soils, the hydrology, and the geomorphology of a site, and says, based on those abiotic factors, what sort of habitats should we expect to be there? What sort of biological response should we have? Which is very informative because we can manage more in tune with that ecology. But the nice thing about it is, if we look across the landscape, we could say, okay, let's say we wanted to make more bottomwood hardwood forest. Because we could look to places that have the right soils, the right geomorphology, and the right hydrology, and restore that habitat there. So the process works in both ways. It can work at a local scale and a more regional scale to help steer what we want to do. There are gap analyses. This is from Mike Jennings, used to be with Interiors, now at University of Idaho. In the simplest sense, many of us are probably familiar with gap, but what you would do is, first you'd have to understand what sort of habitats you need for a given species or complex of species. You'd map that on the landscape. Then you would overlay conservation areas and see where the gaps are. So here on that right panel, you have the gray is the range of a milk snake. Black is the current footprint of protected areas. You overlay the two, and that's where the arrows are, so you have where the range is actually protected by conservation areas. And you can say, okay, are we happy with that coverage? Do we have gaps? And how do we go about filling them? So now we'll talk about building this puzzle. And fortunately, in the 1980s, we had ANILCA, which created 80 million square miles of public lands in Alaska. A lot of it's BLM, Park Service, Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service. I'd have to get with my Region 7 counterparts, but I guess the question I would pose is, we have the pieces there, but is the puzzle complete? I mean, these are huge pieces, but that doesn't preclude working together to make sure we're getting wide ecosystem coverage and spread of these species. We have the pieces, is the puzzle in place? When we look at the western United States, there's quite a bit of federal land as you start going west of Texas, and that's all federal lands there, and if we color it the same, again, many, many pieces we can use to help build this puzzle, and which was very fortunate for us, so we can make it happen. When you start getting east, of the Continental Divide, or Texas towards the east, it gets more challenging. but there are still tools, and we heard some today that's going on in the Everglades and the Blackfoot Challenge. I definitely appreciate the information given to me by the Kelly McDowell, Complex Manager in Southern Texas, who does a lot of this work. But the tools, fee interest, conservation easements, conservation buyers, private lands, safe harbor. We have some techniques in our back pocket to help build that puzzle and work with partners to facilitate that. And of course, it builds those conversations, as we heard a couple times this morning. Other examples, I won't get into this much, but in the Southwest, there's the Sky Island Alliance, where we have high elevation species that are of conservation concern, and it's the same process that we heard today with Blackfoot in the Everglades, where you bring people together and you have those conversations between the feds, universities, private landowners, researchers, the press, and together, what's nice about it is people begin to see how their contribution, how their piece fits into that puzzle, and it gets very inspiring and motivating and becomes successful. So this is another sort of successful landscape sort of cooperative of people working together to build more species and habitat stewardship. Just to wind up here pretty soon, there's other elements to this that are important. After you define that issue, you define what success would look like, and you begin to build that puzzle. You do want to monitor and evaluate it and say, is this working? Is it achieving what we wanted it to do? And then you bring in that adaptive management loop and say, if it is, great. If it's not, then what do we need to change and what do we need to do? So we want to keep attentive to it. We bring in feasibility, as Heather spoke about, politics, economics, what are our missions? That all falls into this. Education and outreach are also very important. I won't deny the fact that it's hard to do. Conceptually, it's very simple. We could talk about all we want to, but until we get on the ground implementation, which is the true measure of success, and that's the hardest part to do. And undeniably, I think time and again, what these exercises show, that they take someone who's committed to the process, committed to the area, and drives that process and drives it home. They're impassioned about it, and they make it happen, and they foster that sort. They're kind of a catalyst for making this work. And I guess if there's any skeptics left in the audience, this is, again, as Chris brought up, that's happening, in other places. In Southern Africa, you have this initiative between Namibia, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Angola, and Botswana, war-torn countries, somewhat very depressed economies. They're due to sign off on this fall. And so you have Victoria Falls, you have Chobe, you have Kafue, you have the Caprivi Strip, all these beautiful national parks trying to work together collaboratively and manage that area as one large ecosystem. So it is going on. And here you have totally different ownerships, different countries working together. And what we're talking about here and discussing with you is we're talking about, the same country, a lot of stuff within the same agency, so it's completely doable. So we got to get it done. And so just to summarize here, so key points: maximize an area's contribution to the most pressing conservation and management issues in the landscape, build that context, define the issue, frame the target, work collaboratively to build that puzzle, monitoring, evaluation, and then commitment to the process so that we see it through. That's all the formal material we have, but we definitely, we generally like to hear more from you about this topic. If you like it, you dislike it, concern, support, please share.
It's a really big room, so it's not really intimate, but
There's got to be something.
yeah, there's got to be
In the
something.
back.
What you're talking about is very fascinating to me, but I have a concern that it seems like what you're really presenting is just that we need to make the preserves bigger. And what it strikes me is that what we're tiptoeing around is a much more fundamental issue, particularly when you talk about ecosystem services. Shouldn't we be finding a way for us to live on this planet in a way that we don't have to have special preserves to keep places for the wildlife? In other words, the entire planet becomes a wildlife refuge for
Thank you for offering that. Actually, I would totally agree with you. I do want to say in relation to that, I think that's why we're kind of trying to emphasize the education and outreach component, because that's really a necessary part. If the people don't care about the land, then really, we have nothing. We can manage the reserves all we want, but we need to have that connectivity. And we can't control where the wildlife is going to go. It's going to go, through people's backyards. And if they're not helping us in the context of managing the larger conservation estate, then really we're losing in the end. So that is a big component there, I think. Did you want to add anything?
I guess before I chime in, would anybody else like to respond to that? Yes, sir.
I think it's an idealistic viewpoint.
It's good. If people can't hear, there is a microphone up front. We're good or not?
Thank you. I agree with the idea that was presented there, but I think being a realist, it's very idealistic to think that we're going to be able to reach the masses. The masses are increasing. I think, ultimately, we're just going to have to be happy with sanctuary areas that we can visit, because we're not controlling our population. We're not stopping development. We're going to keep increasing, and we're just going to have to be satisfied with having samples in the future, unless something drastic happens to stop human population growth. That's the ultimate problem.
Anybody else? There's a sir to your right.
I'm not Fish and Wildlife Service employee, but I just went to a lecture on Theodore Roosevelt and found out that if you're an exuberant optimist, it's really because you're schizophrenic. So I am. But I'm extremely idealistic, and I've been involved in a land conservation project with Fish and Wildlife Service. And when we started off, we had a very reasonable goal. The goal just kept growing and growing, and then the southern state, we have 208,000 acres protected, and only 12,000 of the Fish and Wildlife Service refuge, but it was a part of getting there. But now we've got the neighbors working on a sustainable economic development plan that says, not just in this region, but throughout all of our rural areas, we want an economic development plan that's sustainable, that doesn't include roads, sewer, water, bridges, but uses agriculture and downstream forest products, tourism, and recreation and wildlife as the basis supporting the human population with a higher standard of living. And I think exactly what you said is where we got to go. And yes, we got to deal with population control. And it bothers me we didn't talk about this in the meetings here earlier, but I think you did. And as to your strategy about how you get there and work on collaborative, there's one thing that I think we learned that I would share with you, and that is we actually put it in Latin, we didn't like to say it too openly. Lex humanus implementor. That means when you're on your road putting in a landscape conservation project, unashamedly you did it. Just get it.
Are there other questions or comments?
Well, I guess I'm a little confused because what you were talking about, I thought was what the landscape conservation cooperatives were basically established to do. So I'm not quite sure why we're giving it a different title. So I guess that's my confusion.
Well, Melinda, I think you're right. The way I would answer that is, I think this sort of exercise would fall under the LCCs, but I would, like all things that we do, I think we all have important roles to play in how that sort of strategy unfolds, and so refuges would be a key player in that, and defining what their role is and how they fit into that puzzle. But I do think that we would seek LCC guidance and direction to help build those conversations across the landscape. Of course, we can facilitate that, and we have examples of doing that, and we should be players in that. I don't, at this point, I couldn't say yes or no. I'd have to talk to more of the leadership. Is this something that Refuges itself would be stimulating to do, would be leading? I don't think so at this point. I think it would be fall under that LCC sort of cloak.
And just to add to that a little bit too, I think the concept really does go a little bit beyond, you know, just what the LCCs are doing. The LCCs are definitely a great forum for this type of a thing. But, you know, when we're talking about education and outreach, and we're talking about so many of these other components, that really the LCCs are a forum to bring people together, and that's great, and to share information and get that out there. But really, you know, I think the concept, it goes a little bit even farther beyond what we're talking about when we're just talking about LCCs, so. Thank you, though.
I guess one last bit on that. I personally worry that sometimes when we see these sort of larger landscape initiatives or these more regional projects, that we kind of throw them into the LCC bucket and say, oh, that's you know, that I know you're not doing that, but I think you give a point, oh, that's LCC or that's LCC. Personally, I see no reason why any employee with Fish and Wildlife Service could not embrace LCC principles and help implement that and work with LCCs to help foster ideas such as this. I make it akin to like the LMRD program, the Land Management Research Demonstration Biologists that use refuges as testing grounds to try novel management techniques which are applicable to other landscapes. You don't have to be an LMRD refuge to embrace that concept. Any refuge can do that. And so I see this sort of thing. We want to definitely be working collaboratively with the LCCs, but we all have a piece and all a contribution to make to promote this and move it forward.
So as a follow-up question, so are you suggesting that we need another structure that supersedes the LCCs or something?
No.
I guess I'm just thinking that the whole reason we set up the LCCs was to implement these principles that you just presented. I mean, I don't have any argument with any of the principles. I think that's great. So what are you suggesting that we should do that we aren't already, you know, working towards, I guess?
Well, I think one major thing is just to actually design a national collaborative conservation strategy. So this would be similar to like the Climate Strategic Action Plan, an actual paper that's going to guide all of our goals and all of these objectives that we want to reach, and really to design that with our partners, you know. And so LCCs, again, are a perfect forum maybe to start those discussions and to bring people together. But I don't know that we actually have a full strategic plan that would cover all of the concepts that we were talking about today. LCCs definitely are a great jumping off point for that, and a lot of the groundwork has definitely been laid, as I was talking about some of those, with the LCCs and some of our other policies that we already have. But I think we need to take it a step further and actually have a strategic plan and a policy how we're going to go about implementing this national conservation strategy. So.
Kind of following up on that discussion, I'm a little bit confused in that the title says National Collaborative Conservation Strategy, but then the last part of the presentations focus more on an ecosystem or like a physiographic region basis. So is the mindset here to build this at that smaller scale that's very manageable, or are we actually going to undertake a national approach with this?
I think actually it would be from both directions, because as I kind of tried to stress when I was saying, you know, when we say national, we're just talking about a policy or a strategic plan that's based at the national level. So something that guides us, that's unified policy. But really, all of the different ideas that go into that policy and our different goals, our different objectives are set at the local, regional, and state levels. And so I think that's really important to keep in mind. So we do need to take it from the smaller scale and really build it from the ground up. I think that's really the only way to go about it. A lot of these areas are already there. We need to see what's already there and what's missing, and then go about seeing how we can work with our partners and then design some sort of a national unified strategy for conservation. So I don't know if that answered it, but let me know if it didn't.
Well, just to follow up, because the reason I asked, because I'm from the Region 4 in the Southeast, and working through the many different bird joint ventures, we've been doing exactly this for 15 years now, especially in the lower Miss and the Gulf Coast regions. And we've been really successful at doing it, but there's still a long way to go, even at that small spatial scale. And so, on one hand, I applaud the group for going and promoting the SHC context, which is exactly what this is. I think the focus needs to be at those smaller spatial scales where you can bring the partnerships together, because even in the lower Miss or the Gulf Coast region, which are probably the two most advanced ones, or even the Prairie Pothole region, there are still many, many gaps and hurdles to get over to take that next step. And so I think we're going in the right direction. I would just encourage folks to realize existing partnerships and the planning that's already going on, and be careful with the national strategy. If that's going to be a national strategy, it's kind of at the 50,000-foot umbrella, and then you speak more explicitly to the lower spatial scales of where the rubber hits the road.
Well, I think between you and Heather, you answered a lot of my question. But my question kind of related to, we heard from Greg Sekanic that one of our charges, one of the things he wants to get done is come up with a national strategic growth policy. That's what a lot of this book's about this time. So I'm trying to kind of figure out how things like recommendation 3, the rapid up-down assessment of our existing land acquisition priorities, and the conservation planning tabs, all these things that are strategic growth fit into the national strategy you gave us. I mean, it seems like you gave us a ton of tools to help us over the next 2 days. But it seems to me like this gentleman said, I guess this is step 1, which is the 50,000-foot, finally have a policy that tries to steer all of us 8 regions in somewhat of the same direction. Is that the goal? Is that the intent?
Yeah, I think both of you actually really hit it on the nail. So it's kind of just, the beginning phases of trying to get on a unified front, bringing all the partners to the table, and really seeing what our goals are, and setting some of those goals, some of those conservation targets, setting out some sort of a map for what we already have, what's missing, and then seeing perhaps how we could go about starting to implement some of those. But definitely, point well taken, that we need to take it at smaller scales and keep all of that in mind as well as we go about thinking about this stuff.
I guess the only contribution I would make to that is, I think, like many approaches, starting simple and then building complexity is usually a good strategy, and that can happen, in multiple ways. One of them is, sure, it's relatively simple to create a national strategy to do it, but the devil's in the details. Similarly, as the other gentleman was saying, when you actually do the work on the ground, it's starting local and then branching out from there is also a way to go. And so I think it's kind of this marrying of scales and approaches that will get us to that sort of successful state, because it was yet to be defined, but one that we are being, refuges are a catalyst in bringing that conversation out there to how do we extend our mission and our intentions across that wider landscape. And that, and that's going to be, it's going to take different forms, different places, but I think it's very encouraging that, we're here today talking about it and saying, hey, we recognize this is very important, and these are goals that we want to achieve and strive for.
Yeah, I'd like to just build on a few of the earlier comments by Melinda and others, just that I think that it seems like a lot of what you offered up makes sense, and the question is, who does it, how do we do it? And I would argue that the starting point should be to try to work at the landscape scale through landscape conservation cooperatives, which, if they're fully functional, will also serve as a national network, which will give you kind of this national strategy that you're looking towards. And that the way to think about landscape conservation cooperatives is an opportunity, or I guess the way I would look at it is that refuges have this incredibly critical role to play within landscape conservation cooperatives to guide this conversation about strategic growth of protected lands within these cooperatives that are already going to bring the partners together and all the information that you've laid out together. And so I think what's needed is to start from that point and see what's needed within the National Wildlife Refuge System to make this work.
Thank you. I agree. Well, I'll start off by saying that since this is really at the very beginning stages, at this point it's really just a concept. And so that would be kind of tough to go about that already, just because that's more of an implementation thing, I would think. But it is definitely a very good point. And if you're going to set something like this up, as we mentioned several times, you have to like constantly go back and see whether what you're doing is working, because if not, you know, then you need to reevaluate and fix whatever's wrong. And the second half, I guess, that you were talking about, I'm sorry, would you? Yeah, so again, I think as Grant was kind of saying, I guess it really just depends, and we're talking about involving multiple partners. So obviously, if the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is leading it, then you know, we're usually looking at species. So probably be more species focused. But if we're going to see where our goals align with our partners, then there may be certain cases where it makes more sense to look at number of acres protected in order to preserve that biodiversity. So.
Also, I think that that's sort of one of the strengths of the concept too, is that you're not just focusing on species, because obviously you have these different entities who have different mandates, and they all have similar goals that overlap. So I personally don't like to think of, you know, I mean, I know that you kind of have to have some sort of measurable approach, but I also think that thinking of things on a landscape scale is a really useful way to approach it. And my hopes is that a strategy like this would encompass both of those through working with the different agencies and the public and private ownership. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't have a good answer for yes and no, but need to be either or. Right, I personally don't think that, in some cases, I don't think it's appropriate to take a species-centric, you know, perspective.
You have to prioritize.
You do have to prioritize, and I think that that will be part of the process as far as, and that's where the science-based portion will come in, so identifying what landscapes are important, and as I mentioned, like a broad sweep is, you know, a irreversibly invaded cheatgrass landscape versus a sagebrush habitat. Now, the contrary to that, too, is that, you know, I think we're eventually going to have to sort of embrace these novel landscapes that we haven't seen before, and that's, like, probably down the road, but, I mean, that's also something I think we need to start thinking about.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would just jump in and say, I think it's a lot of it, I think, defining that issue, you know, what are you trying to achieve up front, and then that gives you something you can measure, so that could be, you know, habitat, how much habitat, actually making that corridor, so many species in a given area. I think we're getting close to 5 o'clock. If folks want to get up and leave, feel free to do that. If you'd like to stay and talk, we'll stay as long as you'd like. So whatever you prefer doing. We appreciate you coming, so thank you. But feel free to stay if you'd like.
Give the panel a round of hand.
Are there other questions or topics for discussion?
I'd like to present our panelists here with a gift from the conference planning team here. So thank you all so much. It was wonderful. At 5 o'clock downstairs in Exhibit Hall B is a reception put on by the National Wildlife Refuge Association. Please join us there.